Today we're going to build what most homes need, and that's a bigger utility room. This room is very narrow, just really room enough for the washer and dryer. They'd like to put their freezer and their cat's litter box in here, but when you open both doors, if you look at the swing of them, there's not enough room in here for anything. So we're actually going to extend the utility room out into the garage. We've got plenty of room out here. I've got approximately a 6 foot by 6 foot area, plenty of room, and all we need to do is actually just build a wall off this corner and take it straight across. Now it sounds like a big project, but it's really not that difficult to do, and this is something that you ought to be able to do today after watching the show. First thing is to measure our base. We need 6 feet that way. See how tall our wall needs to be. Let's see, 111 1/4. So we're ready to start cutting some wood and get started. Well, the measurement of our wall was 111 1/4, but we're not going to cut our stud that long. The reason for that is we're going to have a piece underneath it, that's called our base plate, and a piece above it, that's called our top plate. And these are 1.5 inches thick. This is a 2x4, but a 2x4 is not 2 inches by 4 inches. It's 1.5 inches thick, and it's 3.5 inches wide. So since we have one on top, one on bottom, we subtract 3 inches. So instead of 111 1/4, we're going to drop down to 108 1/4. Use a square to mark that, and we're ready to cut. A circular saw, as well as a tape measure, a framing square, and a pencil are some of the basic tools you'll need for this framing project. Later on, you'll also need a hammer and a drill. Now that we have all of our wood cut, it's a good idea to lay out our frame and make sure that it looks right. Let me explain what a few of these boards are too before we start. The big pieces are the wall studs that you saw me cut. This on the bottom, this is our base plate. When we set the wall up, this is the bottom of the wall. This is the opening for our door. And then on each side of the door, these shorter studs are called trimmers, one on each side. And then this is the header that goes above the door. This short piece is called a cripple, and it goes from the header to the top of the wall, and it gives us something to nail our sheetrock to after we set the wall up. This piece is called the top plate, and that'll be right along the ceiling once we set the wall up. Now before we nail everything in place, we need to go back one more time and check our measurements. And the first 1.5 inches is where our outside stud goes. So double check 1.5, and I like to put an X where a stud goes. That way I know it's a stud. And the next 1.5 inches is our trimmer for the door frame. So I put a T on that for trimmer. And then we need to measure across to our next one. And our door is a standard door. It's 2 feet 8 inches wide. So we want to go 2 feet 10 inches. That gives us 2 extra inches for a rough opening for the door. That's marked okay. And then it did have a T there for trimmer, because that's the other door trimmer. The next 1.5 inches is another wall stud. So we've got an X there. We're still looking good. Now this is the important stud, because this is where the wall board ends. The wall board is 4 feet wide, and it has to end right in the center of this stud. So we really need to double check this measurement. Yep, 48 inches. That's the center of our stud. One other item before we start nailing, and that's to watch for crowns or bows in the wood. That's where if you look at a stud from the side, it's actually got a bend to it. Studs aren't as high quality as they used to be, so now that's pretty common. An easy way to get past that is to look at the grain of the wood. Here's the center, you've got circles going around it, and the center is sort of offset this direction. So we want them all to be that way. This one is upside down. Flip it over like that, now most of the rings are there. The first part that we nail together is the header, which is the piece that goes above the door. Now the 2x4 studs are 3.5 inches wide, so the header needs to be the same width. They're 1.5 inch thick, so we need 2 2x4 studs and another 1/2 inch. So we've taken a piece of wallboard that was 1/2 inch thick, cut that, and we just lay it in between. Since this is not a load-bearing wall, it doesn't have to be real strong, it just has to be the right width. So we square that up, we're ready to nail it together. Now we're ready to start nailing studs. Now when we do the first one here on the end, one thing that you ought to do is go ahead and dull the end of your nail. That way you won't risk splitting the board. Sharp nails split the board a lot, which Just tap it a couple times. That'll round the edge a little bit. You will want to begin nailing the studs together around the outside perimeter of the wall frame, anywhere there's a stud intersecting the top or bottom plate. Once that's all firmly nailed in place, you can begin nailing the interior pieces, like the door trimmers and the cripple where it meets the header. Before we stand our wall up, we need to go ahead and pop off the base trim on both sides. A tool called the Wonder Bar comes in handy here. It can really help you remove the trim without scarring the wall, or the trim itself if you plan on reusing it. Before we stand up our wall, we need to do a little work to make it look like it was built there originally and it's not something we added on later. It needs to be smooth with this wall, but this room also needs to be square. To make sure that it's square, we're going to pull back from the corners. We start here on the edge, and we need to measure over 5/8 of an inch because we're going to be putting wallboard on that's 5/8 of an inch thick. That's for the fire code. We measure from the corner. We hit our mark. We see that we're at 59 3/4 inches. Now we want to pull the same distance from this corner over here. 59 3/4 is the exterior of our wood frame. I'm gonna go find some help to stand up the wall, and when we get back, we'll also put on the wallboard and install the door. Well, before the break, we framed this wall, and now I've got Roger Thayer, my technical advisor, here to help us put it in place. Roger, why don't you go ahead and put a nail in there to just hold it in place. It'll make it easier to work with. All right, now we'll kick the bottom over 5/8 of an inch from the corner, so we'll get our straight wall.
Let's see what we got.
How do we look?
Looks good.
Let's nail that in place then. Great. Well, now we need to go ahead and knock the wall out to our line that we marked earlier, and that way we'll be sure that we're square. Set the level here, we'll use that in a little bit. Roger, you want to hit that on the top and bring it out a couple inches?
Okay.
Okay, let's hit the bottom now. Getting close, a little bit. Okay, let's stop and put a level on it and see how we look. Okay, we look good and level, so let's go ahead and tack the top and the bottom. Roger's putting the nail in at an angle because there's no stud behind the sheetrock where our wall ends, so he has to angle the nail up into the top plate of the wall. The same goes for the bottom of our wall. Since there's no stud back here, I need to angle the nail in through our base plate into the base plate of the existing wall. We don't ever want this wall to move, so we're going to anchor it a couple different ways. We're going to start with glue. Just put a bead on both sides of the base plate. Let it work its way underneath. And it'll also help seal it as well as hold it in place. The glue we're using here is ordinary construction adhesive you can find at any home center or hardware store. We're going to stop right here because we're going to cut this 2x4 out from here to here where the door goes. A little on the corner here. You'll need to lay a bead of glue on the other side of the base plate too. We're also going to screw the wall down as well. So first we start with the drill bit just to get through the wood. When we hit the floor, then we have to go to a masonry bit. The older your floor is, the harder the concrete's going to be. That's one property of concrete. It gets harder and harder with time. Now we put in what's called a tap con, and that's really a screw that is made for concrete. We just want to get it into the top of the board. We don't want to go past that because there's a chance we could break the screw off in there. This is what they look like. It's like an ordinary screw, but it's blue. Just put that in. Well, now we're ready to cut out our bottom plate where the door goes. A reciprocating saw makes cutting the base plate easy. You should wait to cut out the space for the threshold where the door goes until after you've firmly installed the wall frame. That way the frame will stay square and well supported as you fit it into place. Well, now we're ready to hang our sheetrock. Sheetrock typically comes in 8, 10, and 12-foot lengths. But if the sheets you're working with are shorter than the height of your wall, be sure to mount the top of the sheetrock flush with the ceiling. That will put the seams down on the bottom of the wall where they'll be less noticeable. Well, as you can see, we sheetrocked right over the door. That's because we wanted one big piece, not a bunch of little cut-up pieces where we might see lines later after we tape in bed. So now we just cut out the extra sheetrock. Now if I cut the rest of this off with this saw, it'll just fall, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm just going to score it down this side and then swing it open. So we just swing it open, and then where we've got our crease, we just come back here, score it the rest of the way through. The reciprocating saw is handy for cutting out the corners of the door opening. Installing the rest of the sheetrock goes pretty much the same way. You'll need to cut pieces to fit the spaces that are smaller than a full sheet. And once you have it all attached to your studs, you're ready to tape in bed. Spread on a layer of joint compound to cover the seams and let it dry overnight before sanding and adding another coat. Since this is an exterior wall, we're going to add some insulation before we attach the sheetrock to the other side. Next, put the new door frame in place. If your door is a standard size, you should be able to buy one pre-cut to fit. Just ask for a KD or knockdown frame to fit the dimensions of your door. Well, Roger, that's a nice job on the door frame. Let me help you with hanging the door here. Okay. Then we're ready to add our screws. But it's a good idea to drill a starter hole for at least one screw per hinge before you drive the first screws in. Well, we saved a lot of money by recycling this door. We just moved it from the old existing frame up to this KD frame or knockdown frame. Much more inexpensive because ordinarily you'd buy a pre-hung door with the frame. We didn't have to do that. All we had to do was buy an inexpensive frame and mount it. And it would have been a lot of work to pull that old frame out and come back and patch all that sheetrock. So this was less expensive and it was much easier to do. All we've got to do now is shim the outside of this frame once we close the door. And then we're ready to go ahead and put our trim on. Gently force wood shims in between the door frame and the 2x4 trimmer until the gap between them is uniform from top to bottom. You want the door frame to hold firmly in place, but you don't want so much pressure against the door that it's difficult to open. Okay, Roger, how's the door looking there?
Oh, it looks great.
Opens okay?
Fits all right? It's gonna work great.
Good. Well, let's put the screws in and then cut them off.
Okay.
Drill screws through the door frame and the shims and into the trimmer. Then cut or break off the shims. You don't have to worry about cutting them off neatly because the door trim will cover them up along with the edge of the frame. Well, we're ready to add our texture to match the existing wall. Come in and add a little trim to match what's on the outside and paint, and we're done. Now we have a great wall, and best of all, we have a lot more usable space now inside the house.